somewhere in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, buried under centuries of sand and collapsed mud brick, a story was waiting. Not a new story, not a story anyone had invented recently. A story so old that by the time the Bible was written, it had already been told and retold for over 1,000 years. A story about gods who regretted creating humanity, about a world-ending flood, about one man chosen to survive when everyone else was swept away. You know the story, except you probably know a different version of it, because this one came first, the Atrahasis tablet. That's what we're exploring tonight, a piece of ancient clay pressed with tiny wedge-shaped marks carrying what may be one of the oldest flood narratives ever committed to writing. And the question it raises, the one that scholars have been carefully, seriously wrestling with for over a century, is both simple and enormous. Did the biblical story of Noah draw from a tradition that was already ancient when Babylon was young? Where did the flood story really come from? And what does the older version tell us that the later one doesn't? Before we go anywhere, I want to ask you something. Leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Right now, people are tuning in from London and Lagos, from Sao Paulo and Seoul, from quiet bedrooms in the American Midwest, and from late-night kitchens in Melbourne. I read these, and something about seeing all those places and times lined up together feels exactly right for a story about the deep shared roots of human civilization. So drop your city and your local time. It takes 2 seconds and it genuinely makes this better. Now, back to the clay. Here's what makes the Atrahasis story remarkable, and why it's worth taking slowly and carefully. This isn't fringe history. It isn't ancient alien territory or conspiracy archaeology. The Atrahasis epic is one of the most studied texts in the ancient Near East, held in major museums, translated by serious scholars, debated in peer-reviewed journals. The tablets themselves date primarily to around 1700 BCE, written in Akkadian cuneiform by Babylonian scribes who were probably copying from even older oral and written traditions. Some fragments may connect to Sumerian predecessors going back further still. This is documented, physical, careful scholarship. The kind where people spend careers learning dead languages just to read one clay tablet correctly. And yet, even with all that rigour, the story raises questions that nobody can answer with complete certainty. Did the authors of Genesis know about Atrahasis directly? Were they working from a shared older tradition that neither fully preserved? Did flood myths emerge independently across cultures because floods are simply one of the most catastrophic things that can happen to a human community? Scholars have argued all of these positions, and tonight we're going to sit with all of them, not because the answer doesn't matter, but because sitting with genuine uncertainty is what honest history actually looks like. What we'll trace together is the full arc of the Atrahasis story from the beginning. We'll meet the gods who built the world on the backs of lesser gods who eventually went on strike. We'll watch a newly created humanity multiply until the noise becomes unbearable. We'll follow the plagues and droughts that were sent to thin the population before more drastic measures were considered. We'll hear the warning delivered in the strange, indirect way that ancient divine communication worked, wrapped in dream logic and technicalities. We'll watch the flood come in language that is genuinely devastating, even across the gap of 4,000 years. And then we'll stand in the aftermath, where the gods face what they've done, and realise they may have gone too far. Along the way we'll compare, carefully, without forcing the pieces to fit where they don't, because the parallels between Atrahasis and Noah are real and striking. But so are the differences, and those differences tell us just as much as the similarities do. If you're settling in for sleep right now, this is a good story for that. It moves slowly through deep time. It asks you to picture worlds that no longer exist. It doesn't rush toward conclusions, it lets the mystery breathe. So get comfortable. Wherever you are in the world, whatever hour the clock says on your wall or your phone, let the noise of the day go quiet. We're going back a very long way, back to a valley between two rivers where cities were just beginning and someone first pressed a reed into wet clay to ask the oldest question civilization ever thought to write down. What does it mean that we almost weren't here at all? Picture the land between two rivers. Not as it looks today, not the modern borders and politics, not the satellite image of a dry and contested region. Picture it as it was in deep antiquity, maybe 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, when the first real cities were just beginning to take shape, the Tigris running swift and cold from the mountains of the north, the Euphrates moving slower, wider, spreading across a flat alluvial plain before both rivers lost themselves in the marshes and the sea. Between them and around them, one of the most fertile stretches of land the ancient world had ever seen. Rich black soil deposited over millennia by flooding, reeds tall enough to hide in, fish in quantities that seem impossible to us now, date palms heavy with fruit, and a sky that could turn from hot and clear to violent and apocalyptic with almost no warning at all. This is Mesopotamia. The word itself comes from Greek, meaning roughly the land between the rivers, though the people who actually lived there had their own names for their own places. Sumer in the deep south, the oldest urban civilization we know of, already building temple complexes and keeping written records before almost anyone else on Earth. Akkad to the north of that, whose language and empire would eventually absorb Sumer and become the dominant cultural force of the region for centuries. Babylon rising later on the Euphrates, becoming the city that gave its name to an entire era of law and literature and astronomical observation. Assyria further north still, along the upper Tigris, fierce and expansionist, but also deeply literate, with palace libraries that would eventually hold some of the most important ancient texts ever discovered. These weren't separate worlds that occasionally bumped into each other. They were layers of the same ongoing civilization, inheriting from their predecessors, translating older texts into newer languages, arguing with old ideas, revising old stories, carrying forward traditions across thousands of years in ways we can sometimes trace and sometimes only guess at. What all of them shared was the river, and with the river came flooding. Not always gentle, not always predictable, not the kind of seasonal flooding that farmers can plan for and celebrate. The Tigris and Euphrates are mountain-fed rivers, and their behaviour is famously unpredictable compared to something like the Nile, which floods on a remarkably consistent annual schedule. In Mesopotamia, a sudden snowmelt in the northern ranges, combined with heavy spring rain, could send walls of water across the flat plain with almost no warning. Archaeological evidence from the city of excavated in the 1920s by Leonard Woolley, revealed a thick layer of water-deposited silt, sitting between older and newer occupation levels, suggesting a flood of genuinely catastrophic scope somewhere in the region's ancient past, though scholars debate exactly what it means and how far it extended. There may have been multiple floods of regional significance over the millennia, each one capable of erasing a community, drowning livestock, destroying grain stores, toppling the mud brick walls that cities were built from. Mud brick dissolves in water. That's worth sitting with for a moment. The very material that Mesopotamian civilization built itself from, the material of every house and temple and palace wall, is destroyed by the thing the rivers do. So when Mesopotamian storytellers reached for the most powerful image of total destruction, the most visceral metaphor for divine punishment and cosmic reset, flooding wasn't abstract. It wasn't metaphor pulled from some distant imagined catastrophe. It was the thing that could happen any year, the thing that had happened within living memory, or within the memory of grandparents, or within the stories that grandparents told. When the rivers rose above their banks and the world went underwater, it felt like a decision, not a weather event, a decision made by forces larger than human beings. And that feeling, that sense that the flood is not random but intentional, that it means something, that somebody or something chose it, is exactly where myth begins. Myth in Mesopotamia wasn't quite what we usually mean when we use the word today. We tend to use myth as a polite word for story that isn't true, a polite way of saying someone believes something we don't. But in the ancient world, myth was doing several things simultaneously, and doing all of them seriously. It was explaining, why does the world work this way? Why do humans have to labour? Why do we die? Why do floods happen? Myth gave those questions answers that fit the emotional reality of life, not the mechanical reality, but the felt reality, the sense that the universe is responsive and meaningful rather than random and indifferent. It was also preserving memory. Real events, real floods, real political upheavals, real ecological disasters got encoded into mythological narratives that could survive for centuries through oral tradition. The story changes shape as it travels, but something of the original event might persist in it, like a seed inside a fruit that looks nothing like the seed. It was also establishing legitimacy. In Mesopotamia, the connection between kingship and divine approval was not decorative. It was constitutional. Kings ruled because the gods had chosen them, and the stories told in temples and royal courts worked to reinforce that connection, to make the social order feel as inevitable as the rising of the sun. And myth was doing something else too, something harder to name, but maybe the most important. It was exercising moral imagination. It was asking what it would mean if the gods were like this, if the world worked that way, if justice operated on these terms. It was thinking out loud about power and responsibility, and what happens when the most powerful thing imaginable makes a catastrophic mistake. The gods of Mesopotamia were not remote abstractions. They had personalities, rivalries, appetites, and regrets. They held counsel, they argued. They made decisions by consensus, and sometimes by deception. They were organized in a hierarchy that looked remarkably like the political hierarchies of Mesopotamian civilization itself, with a great assembly of gods at the top and lesser divine figures filling roles that echoed the roles of human officials. Enlil, the lord of wind and storm, and the highest executive authority among the gods. Enki, also known as Ea, the god of wisdom and fresh water and the underground ocean, a trickster figure in many ways, someone who operated through cleverness rather than raw power. Anu, the sky god, old and often somewhat passive, the grandfather figure at the very top of the hierarchy. And below these great ones, hundreds of lesser divine beings with specific domains and specific concerns. The temple was where heaven and earth officially met. Every major Mesopotamian city had its own patron deity, and the great ziggurat at the city's centre was understood as that deity's earthly residence. The priests and priestesses who served in those temples weren't just performing ritual for its own sake. They were maintaining a relationship, keeping the divine resident fed and honoured, and therefore inclined to look favourably on the city. The temple complex was also an economic hub, a library, an astronomical observatory, and a school. Which brings us to how stories actually moved through this world. What we call the Atrahasis epic, and what we'll spend most of tonight exploring, belongs to a tradition of literary composition that Mesopotamian scholars call by the Sumerian term, roughly translated as the great narratives or songs. These weren't folk tales in the casual sense. They were composed texts, carefully structured, almost certainly performed aloud in temples and at royal courts, and used as educational material in the scribal schools where the next generation of administrators and priests were trained. When we say epic in this context, we don't necessarily mean long adventure narrative in the Greek sense. We mean a serious, formally composed literary work dealing with foundational themes, creation, destruction, the proper relationship between humans and gods, the origins of the institutions that hold civilization together. Reciting these texts wasn't entertainment, or wasn't only entertainment. It was education. It was ritual. It was the transmission of a civilization's understanding of itself from one generation to the next. The scribes who learned to copy these texts were learning the language, yes, but they were also learning how the world worked, what the gods expected, what it meant to be human in a cosmos ordered by divine will. All of which means that when the Atrahasis story tells us about a flood sent by the gods to solve a problem they had created, it isn't a random ghost story. It's a civilization's considered attempt to understand the most frightening thing it knew, to take the experience of water rising beyond all control, of cities dissolving into mud and silence, and to find in that experience some kind of meaning, some shape, some lesson that could be carried forward and taught to the next generation so they might understand not just what happened, but why, and what it asks of the people who survived. And somewhere in that process, the story acquired its hero. The man who was warned, the man who built, the man who floated above the destruction and lived to tell about it. His name was Atrahasis, and his story was already old when Babylon was young. Atrahasis. The name itself is a kind of verdict. In Akkadian, it means something like exceedingly wise, extraordinarily attentive, or the very clever one. Not wise in the abstract, not a philosopher sitting under a tree. Wise in the sense that matters in a dangerous world. Someone who listens, understands, and reacts correctly when the stakes are absolute. In the context of the story, Atrahasis is not a king in gleaming regalia or a demigod with superpowers. He's more like a sage, a trusted figure, a kind of ideal elder. Later traditions sometimes associate him with kingship, but in the epic that bears his name, his authority comes less from a crown and more from his character. He hears, he obeys, he interprets dream warnings, and he navigates the impossible conflict between loyalty to the gods and loyalty to his own people. He is the human who does not panic, the human who understands that survival sometimes means listening more carefully than anyone else. But Atrahasis is not the starting point of the epic. He arrives after the problem has already begun. The core of the story, the engine that drives it forward, is something much colder and more unsettling, a labour dispute among the gods. The text as we have it opens in a time before humans. The great gods exist. The cosmos has been structured in a basic way. The earth and the sky are in place, but the system is not running smoothly. The upper gods, the ones with rank and privilege, have delegated all the hard physical work to a class of junior deities. These are usually called the etched in the text, a kind of divine workforce, ditch diggers, canal cutters, irrigation labourers. They are the ones who maintain the cosmic infrastructure that makes life possible, especially in a world where water management is everything. And they are miserable. They dig channels endlessly. They pile baskets of soil, they maintain dikes and levees in a landscape that will collapse back into swamp or desert if anyone relaxes. Their work is hard, unending, and this is important, taken for granted by the gods who benefit from it. Eventually, after years measured in divine time, they snap. They stop working, burn their tools, and surround the house of Enlil, the executive god of wind and authority, with what is essentially a strike and a riot combined. Already the story has given us a world where the fundamental problem isn't sin in the moral sense, but labour and overload. The cosmos is out of balance because someone has to do the dirty work of keeping it going, and that someone doesn't want to do it anymore. The senior gods respond the way overburdened elites often do in ancient stories, with a council meeting. They gather in assembly. Anu, the old sky god, presides but doesn't drive events. Enlil is furious. His authority has been challenged. The lower gods have shown that they can refuse, and this is where another major divine figure steps forward, Enki, also called Ea. Enki is the god of fresh water, wisdom, cunning, and, crucially, problem-solving. If Enlil is the boss who shouts orders, Enki is the consultant you call when shouting stops working. In the Atrahasis epic, Enki is the voice that keeps trying to find workarounds, compromises, and clever solutions that preserve life without openly defying the hierarchy. When the Igigi revolt, the gods stand on the edge of open civil war. One option would be to crush the lower gods by force. Another option is to redesign the system. The epic tells us they choose redesign. Enki proposes a radical innovation, create a new kind of being whose job is to take over the labor that has pushed the Igigi to the breaking point. That new being is humanity. So the Atrahasis story is not primarily about the flood. It is about why humans exist in the first place, and why our existence is entangled with suffering, work, and mortality. The flood is just one chapter in a longer arc that runs from creation to crisis, to a negotiated compromise between gods and humans. According to the epic, humans are manufactured from a mix of divine and earthly elements. A god associated with intelligence and rebellion is sacrificed, his blood or flesh used as a key component. Clay from the earth is mixed with this divine substance. The result is a being that's neither fully god nor fully animal, but something in between, capable of language, organization, and complex labor, but still bound to the ground, still vulnerable. The implications are hard to miss. Humans are made to work. They are designed as a solution to someone else's problem. Their purpose is to bear the yoke that the junior gods refused. At first, this solves everything. The Igigi are freed from their backbreaking tasks. Humans take over irrigation and agriculture and temple service. The gods relax. They receive offerings and sacrifices. They enjoy peace. But this new solution creates a new problem, and this is where the story takes a turn that feels very different from the later biblical version. Humans work, humans reproduce, humans thrive, and as they thrive, they multiply. The cities expand, the fields are full, and the collective presence of these new creatures begins to have a side effect. The texts describe with a word we might translate as noise. The humans are too loud. It's not completely clear whether this noise is literal, children crying, animals, city life, or metaphorical, the disturbance of divine tranquility by a restless, ever-growing human population. Either way, Enlil hears it as an intolerable disruption. It keeps him from resting. It feels like a permanent challenge to his peace. The very beings created to stabilize the cosmos have become a source of instability. So the epic proposes a second, even more chilling divine problem. How do the gods control the numbers and behavior of humans they themselves brought into existence? The Atrahasis epic answers that question not with a single punishment, but with a sequence. Before there is a flood, there are plagues, famines, and droughts. Each one is an attempt to cut the population back down to a more manageable size. Each time, Enki steps in quietly to help humans survive, offering instructions through dreams, suggesting ritual actions that can end the plague or bring back the rains, giving Atrahasis the knowledge needed to intervene without openly confronting Enlil. This is one of the central tensions of the story. Enlil embodies order through control, even if it means mass death. Enki embodies order through adaptation and mercy, even if it means bending the rules. Anu sits above them both, more symbolic than active. Other gods play roles on the margins, but this conflict between harsh executive authority and cunning preservation drives the whole narrative. The flood, when it finally arrives, is not Plan A. It is the last, brutal option after lesser measures have failed to keep humanity quiet and limited. Enlil, exasperated that plagues and famines have not had the desired long-term effect, opts for a total reset, a deluge that will drown the cities, wash away the unwanted noise, and return the world to something closer to its pre-human stillness. Enki cannot openly defy the divine assembly, but he also cannot accept the annihilation of his human allies. So he looks for a loophole. The epic preserves different versions of how he does this. But the pattern is clear. He communicates indirectly with Atrahasis, often through dreams, coded warnings, or instructions given to a wall or a reed hut that Atrahasis can overhear. The letter of the divine oath is preserved. Enki does not simply shout, "A flood is coming," but the spirit of mercy is smuggled through the cracks. This structure is important for understanding the epic's larger themes. Atrahasis is not an arbitrary favourite. He is the human who listens carefully enough to catch what is not said directly. He stands in for a kind of ideal listener, attentive to dreams, sensitive to signs, able to interpret warnings that others miss. His wisdom is not magic, it is vigilance. Taken as a whole, the Atrahasis epic is about more than one catastrophe. It's a meditation on four intertwined questions that haunted Mesopotamian thought. Creation. Why were humans made at all, and what are we for? The answer here is unsettling. We are essential workers in a cosmic economy that does not necessarily have our comfort as its primary goal. Suffering. Why is life full of toil, disease, famine, and disaster? The text suggests that much suffering is not random. It comes from deliberate attempts by higher powers to regulate a system that keeps slipping out of their control. Limits. Why don't humans live forever, and why can't we multiply without end? The narrative moves toward the idea that mortality and social constraints are not accidents. They are imposed boundaries meant to keep the world from collapsing under the weight of unchecked growth. Survival, in a world governed by such forces, what does it mean to be wise? Atrahasis answers by listening, by acting decisively when the chance appears, and by accepting that survival sometimes means entering into new kinds of agreements with the very powers that nearly destroyed you. The flood, then, is not the story. It is the climax of a long negotiation between gods who want quiet and humans who, by their very existence, make noise. It's one episode in a cycle that begins with divine overwork, passes through revolt and invention, and ends in a fragile balance. Humans limited but alive, gods inconvenienced but satisfied enough to let the new world continue. When later traditions picked up pieces of this narrative and reshaped them, they often focused on the boat, the animals, the rain. Atrahasis asks us to look at something deeper. The uneasy contract between power and vulnerability, between those who decide and those who endure the consequences. And at the centre of that contract, standing on the deck of a boat that never asked to be built, is a single human being whose name means simply the very wise. To get from that tense, shifting world of gods and labour disputes to a tablet you can hold in a museum case, you need one more invention, writing. In the case of Atrahasis, that writing is cuneiform. The word comes from the Latin for wedge-shaped, and that's basically the whole technology. You take a flat piece of wet clay. You take a stylus, usually a cut reed with a triangular tip. You press the stylus into the clay at different angles and depths. Each press leaves a wedge. Combinations of wedges make signs. Combinations of signs make words, names, and eventually whole stories about floods and revolts and clever humans who listen to dreams. It didn't start that way. The earliest cuneiform signs were mostly about accounting, grain rations, livestock, jars of oil. Over time, people in Mesopotamia discovered that the same system of marks could record not just quantities but language itself, sounds, syllables, and ideas. By the time the Atrahasis epic is taking shape, cuneiform is a mature script, used for royal inscriptions, legal contracts, hymns, incantations, and long, complex narratives. Clay as a writing surface seems fragile. It's easy to imagine these tablets crumbling in someone's hands. But in the long run, clay is a brutally durable medium. A letter written on papyrus, or leather or bark, will rot, burn, or be eaten. A clay tablet, once dried, and especially once baked, becomes stone-like. It can survive fire. It can survive a building collapse. It can sit in a ruined city, buried under mud brick and ash for 3,000 years. When we talk about the Atrahasis tablet, we're really talking about bits of fired earth that have outlived entire civilizations. Those tablets did not write themselves. They come from a particular social world, scribal schools. In many Mesopotamian cities, there were institutions sometimes called tablet houses. These were training centers where boys, usually from families with means or from temple households, learned the craft of writing. It was not a casual skill. Cuneiform signs are numerous, and the script can work on phonetic, logographic, and syllabic levels at once. To become a scribe, you had to memorize hundreds of signs, learn standard formats, master different languages, Sumerian, Akkadian, and then practice. A day in a scribal school might involve copying lists of signs, writing out model contracts, reciting standard proverbs, and slowly working up to literary texts. Important compositions, including myths and epics, functioned as advanced exercises. You learned not only to read them, but to reproduce them on fresh tablets. This is how stories like Atrahasis were both preserved and transmitted. Each new generation of scribes wrote the text again. But copying was never entirely mechanical. When a student or a master scribe copied an older tablet, several things could happen at once. They could aim for fidelity, keeping the sequence of lines, the divine names, the structure of the story. They could also correct things they thought were wrong. Fix grammar, update spelling, swap an older expression for a newer, clearer one. And in some cases they could add, omit, or slightly rework lines for emphasis, clarity, or local taste. This creates what scholars sometimes call a tablet tradition. Atrahasis is not a single definitive master scroll from which all others descend unchanged. Instead, it exists as a family of manuscripts, spread across time and space, old Babylonian copies from one city, later recensions from another, versions that break off mid-story, others that preserve only the opening or the flood episode. When we say the Atrahasis epic, we're talking about a composite, a story that once circulated orally, that was written down in various forms, that passed through the hands of dozens or hundreds of scribes. Some versions are more complete, some are more archaic. Some seem to have been adapted for particular cult centers or teaching contexts. We do not have a single original. We have witnesses. Those witnesses are often damaged. Ancient libraries burned. Roofs fell in. Rivers flooded, clay tablets broke, crumbled, or were reused as building fill. When archaeologists dig up a site in southern Iraq, they might find a room littered with tablet fragments, like a smashed ceramic archive. Each fragment is a puzzle piece, a few signs, half a line, sometimes just the corner of a tablet with the end of a single word. This is where modern reconstruction comes in. Scholars trained in Akkadian and cuneiform will sit with these fragments, sometimes in person, sometimes through high-resolution photos or 3D scans. They read what they can. Enlil spoke Atrahasis, the flood. Then they compare those bits to other known copies. If a line on one tablet reads, "He told the wall, 'Reed hut, listen to me,' and a fragment from another tablet preserves, 'Ed hut, lis,' you can align them. Over time, with enough overlaps, a broken line becomes legible. Sometimes a fragment preserves a passage we only had in translation from a later version, letting us see the older wording. Sometimes a tiny piece fills a crucial gap. A divine name, a motive, a measurement for the boat. There are cases where fragments found in different excavations, even different countries, are later recognized as belonging to the same original tablet and mentally joined. The process is never finished. Editions of Atrahasis are provisional, full of brackets and dots marking uncertainties. You might see something like Enlil opened his mouth and speak to the great gods, his brothers. The brackets show where the text is reconstructed from parallels, where letters are guessed, where gaps remain. A tablet tradition is a living object in scholarship. New joins, new readings, and new finds can shift the way a passage is understood. All of this written work sits on top of something older and less visible, orally performed story, before Atrahasis was ever pressed into clay. Versions of this narrative almost certainly existed in spoken form. Priests, court singers, storytellers at temples or in palaces could chant or recite about the creation of humans, the noise of the cities, the plagues, the flood survivor. In oral tradition, stories are flexible. A performer can linger on one episode, shrink another, adjust a divine speech to match local theology, or highlight the role of a particular god favoured in that city. Writing changes that. Once a story is fixed on tablets, certain choices harden. A sequence of events, a set of divine dialogues, a particular name for the hero, Atrahasis, not Ziusudra or Utnapishtim in this version, becomes standard for that textual line. But the written text does not erase oral performance. It interacts with it. A scribe might copy the canonical wording used in the schools, while a temple singer still adds flourishes or compresses for ritual use. Over time, written and spoken versions influence each other. Repeated copying stabilizes key phrases and structures. At the same time, local reciters and creative scribes introduce variations that might in turn get copied if they prove compelling or useful. This is why we can talk about Atrahasis both as a particular written composition and as part of a broader flood story landscape. The clay tablets give us snapshots of how one lineage of that story looked at particular moments. They let us see the bones, the labour revolt among the gods, the creation of humans, the escalating attempts at population control, the final resort to a flood, the quiet rescue through a cunning god and a wise man. Around those bones there would have been living flesh, intonation, gestures, local asides that we can no longer hear. When you picture the Atrahasis tablet now, you can imagine not just a mute block of clay in a glass case, but the whole chain behind it, a boy in a tablet house copying a master's text, a teacher correcting his signs, an older oral poet whose version shaped that master copy, a scribe centuries later adjusting a line, a modern scholar piecing together fragments under a lamp, tracing wedges with their eyes until the sense emerges. The story of the flood before Noah is not only about what happens inside the narrative. It is also about how human beings chose to trap that narrative in earth and wedge marks, so that when their own cities sank into dust and their languages died, the story could still, somehow, be read. By the time European scholars were ready to take Atrahasis seriously, the tablets that carried his name were already ancient rubble, sleeping under fields and villages in what is now Iraq and Syria. The way they woke up is a story in itself. In the 19th century, when European powers were competing for colonies, they were also competing for the past. The Bible had turned places like Nineveh, Babylon and into half-mythical names. Explorers, diplomats, consuls with more curiosity than training started poking around tells, those low, flat mounds that are really the eroded remains of cities built in mud brick. They dug with the tools and assumptions of their time, which often meant aggressively. Huge trenches, little documentation, local workers under foreign supervisors. No radiocarbon dating, no stratigraphic discipline in the modern sense. But they were lucky in one respect. They were digging in a land of clay. At sites like Nineveh, Kuyunjik and Nimrud, workmen began shoveling out thousands of small, solid objects that clinked against their picks. At first these were curiosities, strange bricks covered in tiny wedge marks. You could fit some of them in your hand. Others were larger, like hefty curved roof tiles, their surfaces packed with rows and rows of neat impressions. Crates of these tablets were shipped to London, Paris, Berlin, Istanbul. They were dumped into museum storerooms labelled hastily Kuyunjik, Nineveh, sometimes only Assyria. Early catalogues might note legal text, royal inscription, omen text, based on a curator's guess. Very few people could actually read them. Decipherment was its own slow drama. Scholars like Henry Rawlinson, Edward Hincks, and Jules Oppert spent decades comparing inscriptions, guessing at sign values, arguing about whether cuneiform was alphabetic, syllabic, or something else. They used bilingual inscriptions, especially those carved in both cuneiform and known scripts, as keys. They cross-checked royal names from classical sources. Bit by bit, the wedge marks turned back into language. The early headlines were not about Atrahasis. They were about kings and battles, astronomical observations, and then, in the 1870s, something that made the Western world collectively sit up. A flood story. George Smith, a self-taught Assyriologist working at the British Museum, was going through tablets from Nineveh when he stumbled on a text that described a great deluge, a boat, animals, a sacrifice afterward. This was a tablet from what we now call the Epic of Gilgamesh. When Smith realized what he was reading, a Mesopotamian flood narrative that looked suspiciously like the story of Noah, he is said to have literally jumped up and ran around the room in excitement. Newspapers loved that. They ran stories about a deluge tablet from Nineveh. Biblical debates flared. Had the Babylonians copied the Hebrews? Was the Bible borrowing from a pagan source? Or were they both preserving some older event? In that flare of attention, other flood traditions began to be hunted down among the wedges. Atrahasis at first was not a household name. The tablets that preserve his epic are older and more scattered. Most of the key copies come from the Old Babylonian period, around the 17th century BCE, and many did not arrive in European or Ottoman collections as complete labelled masterpieces. They came as bags of fragments from sites like Sippar, Kish, and other southern Mesopotamian cities. This is where provenance, the question of exactly where a tablet was found, in what building, in what layer, becomes vital, and also where early archaeology lets us down. Some tablets were excavated under controlled conditions and recorded carefully. Others were bought from antiquities dealers in Baghdad or Mosul with little more than "from Babylon" scribbled on a museum form. For Atrahasis, that means our evidence is a patchwork. We have relatively complete Old Babylonian tablets, likely from scribal or temple archives. We have later Assyrian and Babylonian fragments that preserve reworked versions of the story. We have pieces in London, pieces in Istanbul, pieces in Berlin, pieces in private collections that surfaced without clear excavation records. On the face of a given tablet, we might see a colophon, a little note at the end, naming the scribe, the place, and sometimes the purpose of the text. But when that corner is missing, we lose those anchors. Museum catalogues, especially older ones, compound the problem. A tablet might be entered as mythological text in one register, incantation in another. Fragments belonging to the same original tablet can be assigned different numbers because they were acquired at different times. Some pieces were misshelved, mixed in with administrative texts. Others lay unnoticed in trays for decades, until a patient Assyriologist happened to pull them out and recognize a familiar line. The reconstruction of Atrahasis as a coherent epic is really a series of scholarly milestones spread across the 20th century. Early on, individual tablets were published as separate texts, an old Babylonian myth of the gods and a flood, or fragment of a creation and deluge story. Translators recognized overlaps with Gilgamesh and with later flood accounts, but the bigger pattern took time to emerge. As more fragments were copied and published, a few scholars began to suspect they were dealing with a single multi-tablet composition that started with divine labour, moved through the creation of humans, recounted plagues and disasters, and culminated in a flood. Aligning those fragments into a narrative required the same kind of join work we talked about before, but now on a much larger scale. You might have one tablet that begins with the gods complaining of work and ends in the middle of a speech by Enki Ea. Another tablet from another site starts in mid-sentence with Enki speaking to Atrahasis and ends with mentions of a boat. A third, later tablet in a different dialect preserves a flood scene with parallel wording. By comparing phrase patterns, divine names, and narrative sequences, editors could stitch these into a plausible whole and label that composite Atrahasis. Major critical editions, carefully collated with all the known manuscripts laid out and variants noted line by line, arrived only in the latter half of the 20th century. Each new edition tightened the text, rearranged tablet divisions, proposed new restorations where older editors had left gaps, and sometimes argued that certain pieces belonged or did not belong to the same work. Our current Atrahasis epic is the product of that layered scholarly labour, not a single revelation from the earth. So what can we say with reasonable caution about dating and context? The Old Babylonian copies written in Old Babylonian Akkadian and found in southern Mesopotamia are generally placed in the 17th century BCE, give or take. That puts them several centuries earlier than the standard version of Gilgamesh that quotes flood material. The language, orthography, and tablet shapes match what we know from securely dated administrative and legal texts from the same period. These Old Babylonian manuscripts likely come from temple or palace archives and from scribal schools. Colophons suggest some were used as advanced literary exercises, others perhaps formed part of a local canon of myths preserved in institutional libraries. Later, Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian fragments show that the story, or parts of it, continued to circulate in reworked forms. In some of these, the wise flood hero is not called Atrahasis but bears the name more familiar from Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim. The core plot survives. The labels, emphases, and theology shift with time and place. Within those chronological frames, details remain debated. Some scholars argue that the composition of Atrahasis in something like its Old Babylonian form may go back to the early 2nd millennium BCE, drawing on even older Sumerian motifs. Others see later harmonization with royal ideology and temple rituals. The evidence is suggestive rather than decisive. What is clear is that new readings can nudge our understanding in subtle ways. A freshly found fragment might add a line clarifying why the gods are angry, or extend a speech where Enki argues against mass destruction. A re-examined sign, once read as noise, now convincingly read as clamour or uproar, can sharpen how we hear the divine complaint about human overpopulation. A better understanding of a technical term can alter how we picture the boat's construction, or the kind of sacrifice offered after the flood. These shifts don't overturn the fundamental structure: divine labour, human creation, escalating attempts at population control, flood as last resort, secret rescue, new post-flood arrangement. But they refine tone and motivation. They can tilt interpretation. Is Enlil rash or calculating? Is Enki a quiet rebel or a loyal opposition? Is humanity an accident, a tool, or a partner? Because of that, every edition of Atrahasis is, in a sense, a snapshot of where scholarship stands at a particular moment. Brackets expand and contract. Footnotes bloom and wither. New joins are published. Old assumptions are quietly retired. Meanwhile, the tablets themselves, those mute bricks of fired clay, sit in their cases and drawers unchanged. The story they carry is stable in outline, but alive in detail. When you hear the flood before Noah now, you're listening not just to a Bronze Age composition, but to a century and a half of people reading, misreading, correcting, and comparing broken wedges. From hurried digs on Mesopotamian hillsides to whisper quiet museum study rooms, Atrahasis has been slowly pieced back together, line by uncertain line, until the gods can speak again, and a man warned in a dream can start gathering wood for a boat. When the story finally opens, it doesn't begin with a man, or a boat, or a storm. It begins with a labour dispute. The first tablets of Atrahasis drop us into a world where only the gods exist, and even they have to work. Not the high gods, the senior executives of the cosmos, but the junior ones. In Akkadian they're often called the Igigu, the worker deities. They're the ones down in the metaphorical trenches, dredging canals, digging out riverbeds, piling up levees. In a land like southern Mesopotamia, where water is life and also constant threat, that kind of imagery is not accidental. For a long time, we're told, these lesser gods endure it. They dig for thousands of years, numbers that are clearly symbolic rather than literal. Time stretches, canal after canal, dike after dike. Eventually, they snap, in one of the strongest scenes on the first tablet. The worker gods throw down their tools and surround the house of Enlil, the great lord of wind and executive authority. They come at night, torches, noise, anger. It reads like a mythic strike. They are ready, some lines suggest, to burn his house down. The problem on the surface is straightforward. Too much work, for too long, with too little say. The deeper problem is political. The cosmic hierarchy is unstable. The top gods issue commands. The mid-level gods bear the cost. There's no mechanism for appeal until revolt makes one. The senior gods panic. Enlil wants punishment. Others, like Anu, the sky god, are more cautious. They recognize that you can't just annihilate your entire labor force. Someone still has to keep the irrigation system of the universe running. So the question becomes, how do you restore order without going back to the same unsustainable arrangement? The solution they arrive at is elegant and chilling. They decide to create a new kind of worker. This is where humans enter the story, not as beloved children, not as random products of divine playfulness, but as a technical fix to an administrative crisis. Humanity in Atrahasis is an answer to the problem. Who will do the work so the gods don't have to? The text imagines a council where the gods debate the plan. The wisdom god, Enki, or Ea, depending on the version, plays a key role. So does the mother goddess, often called Mami or Nintu. Between practical craft and generative power, they work out a procedure. They will make humans by mixing divine substance with clay. One of the rebellious gods is selected. Sometimes the text points to a deity associated with intelligence or kingship. Sometimes the emphasis is just on a god who has been involved in the revolt. He is killed, and his flesh and blood are combined with clay from the earth. The mother goddess kneads this mixture like dough, recites words over it, shapes it, and from this blend of divine and earthly material, humans emerge. There's a lot going on in that scene. On one level, it explains why humans in this mythic worldview are both lowly and strangely potent. We're dirt and god stuff at the same time. We belong to the ground, but we also carry inside us the restless, noisy, sometimes dangerous energy of a sacrificed deity. Human intelligence, creativity, and unruliness have a narrative source. On another level, the scene is deeply ritual. Sacrifice is not just violence, it's a controlled transformation. The blood of the god is not wasted, it becomes an ingredient. The killing is framed as an offering that makes possible the next phase of cosmic order. This kind of logic, death producing life, destruction reorganized into creation, runs through Mesopotamian religion. It also mirrors what happened in actual temple rituals, where animals were killed, their parts apportioned, their blood used in purifications and consecrations. Clay, too, is not random. In Mesopotamia, clay is everything. Houses, tablets, city walls, canal linings. To make humans of clay is to say, you are made of the same substance as your world. You are literally built from the stuff that holds civilization together. When you hear later texts talk about humans serving the gods, bringing offerings, maintaining temples. This creation scene is the backstory. You were designed for that. Behind the mythic language, there's a recognizable political imagination at work. The original system, high gods at the top, worker gods at the bottom, has broken down under the strain of unequal labour. The fix is not to flatten hierarchy, but to insert another layer. Humans arrive as the new bottom rung. They will perform the exhausting, continuous tasks that keep fields irrigated, temples supplied, canals open. The former worker gods are promoted, the senior gods retain their authority. In other words, Atrahasis describes a divinely sanctioned outsourcing project for people living in kingdoms with kings, governors, priests, and a mass of field workers and canal diggers. This probably felt very familiar. The structure of the universe mirrored the structure of their society. Or perhaps it's better to say the story gave cosmic validation to the structure of their society. If the gods themselves depend on a hierarchy with delegated labour, then human hierarchies can be framed as natural, even necessary. The creation of humans also immediately involves obligations. Once humans exist, they don't just toil anonymously. They sacrifice, they build temples, they bring offerings of grain, beer, animals. In return, the gods are fed, clothed, entertained. This is reciprocity structured as duty. The ritual system becomes the visible expression of the hidden contract that began when divine blood was mixed with clay. Scholars sometimes talk about this whole opening as a charter myth. It doesn't describe, in any literal historical sense, how humans came into being. Instead, it explains why things are the way they are, why work is hard, why labour is constant, why rulers expect service, why rituals of sacrifice and libation are non-negotiable. The story takes social and economic facts and projects them upward into the realm of the gods. At the same time, it leaves room for tension. If humans are created from the blood of a rebel god, there's a suggestion that resistance is in our very composition. We are made to serve, but we are made from the remains of someone who refused service. Later in the epic, when human noise becomes a problem for Enlil, that earlier choice comes back to haunt him. The same qualities that make humans useful, productive, numerous, energetic, make them potentially destabilizing. It's important to keep one foot on the ground here. These lines were not written as scientific descriptions of human origins. They belong to a Bronze Age literary and ritual world filled with symbolism, wordplay, and theological reflection. When we say the gods complain about work or create humans to solve a problem, we are reading metaphors that spoke to people who knew very well that babies came from mothers, and that clay was something you moulded into bricks, not into living beings. But as metaphors, they're powerful. They tell us how some ancient Mesopotamians thought about purpose. Humans exist to carry burdens the gods do not want, to maintain the infrastructure of life, and to perform the rites that keep the divine world content. They also tell us how they thought about order. Rule flows from the top down, labour from the bottom up, with rituals and sacrifices binding the whole structure together. That's the equilibrium the opening of Atrahasis establishes. A cosmic labour crisis is temporarily resolved. A new species takes on the work. Divine politics settle into a new balance. And for a while it works. Too well. Because the next problem isn't that humans aren't doing enough. It's that they're doing too much, multiplying too fast, becoming too loud. And when the gods try to adjust the system again, first with plagues, then with famine and drought, the story takes its first steps toward the flood. The text doesn't jump straight from humans are noisy to wipe everything out. It walks there, step by step. From the perspective of Enlil and the high gods, the problem is not moral evil, it's volume and pressure. Humans are doing exactly what they were built to do, working, reproducing, bringing offerings, filling the land with the bustle of irrigation, grinding, brewing, feasting, singing. The noise of all that activity rises up like constant city traffic under the window of a god who wants quiet. The epic uses a single word, often translated as clamour or uproar. It's the sound of a thriving, dense society. To human ears, that's life. To Enlil, it's an intolerable roar. So he proposes a fix. Not the big fix yet. A smaller, targeted correction. A plague, in the story as we have it. Enlil convenes the assembly of gods and basically says, we need to reduce the human load. The council agrees to let a diseased demon loose among the people. The names vary by version. Sometimes it's a specific god of pestilence, sometimes a more general personification of sickness. But the logic is the same. You don't abolish humanity, you throttle it. Down on earth, Atrahasis feels the effects before he understands the cause. This is where his role in the story expands. He's not just going to be a man with a boat later, he's already the human who pays attention. The people he lives among start dying. The epic gives us a compressed but vivid sense of collapse. Bodies piling up, funerals stacked on funerals, the normal flow of life interrupted by coughing, fever, weakness. Crops might still be growing in the fields, but fewer and fewer hands are there to harvest them. Atrahasis does what humans in this world are supposed to do when disaster strikes. He prays. He laments, he consults elders and diviners. Eventually he turns to the one god who has shown himself sympathetic to humans, Enki, the god of wisdom, who helped make them in the first place. The relationship between Atrahasis and Enki is one of the most interesting threads in the whole epic. Enki is a god, but he behaves like a clever, slightly subversive bureaucrat who knows how to work around official policy without openly defying it. Atrahasis approaches him with ritual humility, but what he's really asking is, can you help us survive a decision made over our heads? In fragmentary lines that scholars have pieced together, Enki responds with what we could call strategic piety. He doesn't tell Atrahasis, rebel. He tells him to organize ritual. Stop feeding Enlil, the source of the plague. Redirect offerings to other gods. Intensify lamentation. In some reconstructions, Atrahasis is advised to build a special shrine and institute a fast. No one is to eat bread, no one is to drink beer, until the plague is lifted. In other words, Enki teaches Atrahasis how to use the levers the human divine system already provides. In the Atrahasis world, gods depend on offerings. Starve them of worship, and they feel it. Not physically hungry, perhaps, but deprived of honour, attention, status. Enlil's plague policy runs into a problem. The very humans you're trying to reduce are the ones keeping your divine ecosystem running. The story imagines this biting. Other gods begin to complain. If Enlil wipes out too many humans, the temples go cold. Fires die on the altars, priests have no grain to mill, no beer to pour, no incense to burn. The practical economic side of divinity asserts itself. A god with no worshippers is a god who has lost something essential. Eventually the pressure works. The plague stops. Human numbers start to recover. The noise rises again. From a narrative perspective, that's crucial. The plague has not solved anything. It has drawn a curve, a temporary dip in population, only for the line to bend upward again. The system reasserts itself. The same mechanism that made humans unbearable in Enlil's eyes. Their resilience, their fertility, their embedding in ritual structures also makes them hard to get rid of without crippling the god's own support network. Enlil is not pleased. We see a pattern forming, divine irritation, drastic measure, unintended side effects, partial reversal. It's like watching a manager try increasingly punitive policies on a workforce, only to realize that every punishment also harms the company. The next attempt is famine. This time the levers are different. Instead of disease, Enlil attacks food. He tries to choke off the supply at its source by interfering with rain, with river levels, with the growth of crops. The text describes fields drying up, granaries emptying, hunger stalking the land. Again, it's a scene that would have resonated deeply in a country where crops depended on controlled flooding and carefully timed planting. And again, Atrahasis goes to Enki. By now, he's learned the structure of the problem. These aren't random disasters. They're policy decisions. If a god decided to produce them, maybe another god, one with different priorities, can help undo them. Enki, for his part, is more constrained. In the logic of the story, he has sworn oaths not to directly oppose Enlil's resolutions, but directly is doing a lot of work there. The wisdom god specializes in indirect solutions. One surviving passage suggests he instructs Atrahasis to change agricultural practice, dam the river in certain places, dig additional wells, shift dependence from rain-fed fields to groundwater and residual moisture. In some readings, Enki even sends fish to the people as an alternative food source when the fields are failing. The details differ between manuscripts, but the theme is consistent: technology and knowledge as survival tools given to a human intermediary who can distribute them. So famine, like plague, is blunted. The people suffer, but they do not collapse to the degree Enlil wants. Human ingenuity, backed by a sympathetic god, turns a cosmic punishment into an extremely bad year instead of an extinction event. The epic runs this cycle at least 3 times in some reconstructions. Plague, drought, famine, each escalating the pressure, each confronted by Atrahasis with Enki's behind-the-scenes aid. The manuscripts we possess are damaged, so not every detail is clear, and scholars disagree on the exact sequence. But they broadly agree on the pattern, repeated. Partial solutions to the human problem that never really fix it. Narratively, this repetition does several things at once. First, it builds inevitability. By the time the idea of a flood appears, the audience has already seen lesser measures tried and fail. It's not just that the gods are capricious, they have attempted calibrated responses. Those responses have backfired or fallen short. So when a more radical proposal comes up, it feels, inside the logic of the story, like the next step in a grim progression. Second, it explores the limits of control. Each calamity is an experiment in top-down management of a complex system. Enlil believes he can dial human numbers up or down like adjusting a volume knob. What the epic actually shows is feedback loops. Kill too many people, and the offerings stop. Cut off the rain, and a clever god teaches irrigation tricks that make your drought less effective. The more you intervene, the more adaptive behavior you trigger. Third, it sharpens Atrahasis as a character. He's not a passive recipient of divine rescue. He prays, yes, but he also listens, organizes, and implements. In the plague episode, he coordinates ritual fasting and sacrifice strategy. In the famine, he mobilizes technical solutions. He becomes the human node in a network that links divine wisdom to everyday survival. This has deep theological implications inside the story world. The high gods deliberate, but their deliberation is not omniscient. They misjudge, they revise, they argue. Their decisions have to be mediated through someone like Atrahasis, who actually has skin in the game. Divine policy without human feedback produces catastrophe. Human counsel, when heeded by a sympathetic deity, can temper disaster. This pre-flood sequence also has parallels elsewhere in Mesopotamian literature. Some royal inscriptions and omen collections imagine the gods sending a sequence of lesser warnings, failed harvests, strange signs, plague, before a final judgment on a city or king. In those texts too, the emphasis is on escalation, on chances to respond before the hammer falls. Atrahasis fits into that pattern, but with a twist. Here, the warnings are not primarily for humans. They're for the gods themselves, A series of experiments demonstrating that you can't easily unmake what you have made. By the time Atrahasis has steered his people through plague and famine, the epic has set up a tension that can't last. Enlil's frustration is reaching a breaking point. Enki's workarounds are pushing against the oaths that bind him. Human resilience, both biological and cultural, keeps reasserting itself. The next solution will have to be different in kind, not just in degree. It will have to be something that bypasses localized rituals, overwhelms irrigation schemes, and doesn't depend on slow attrition. It will have to be water. In the text, the turning point comes almost quietly. Enlil looks out over a world that has survived plague, adapted to drought, engineered its way through famine. The very qualities that made humans useful, persistence, cleverness, tight social bonds, are now the reasons they won't stay down. The noise has returned. That word again, clamour. But now it carries the weight of all those failed experiments. It's not just sound, it's resistance. It's the proof that partial measures cannot permanently solve the human problem. So Enlil proposes something that doesn't nibble at the edges. He wants to reset the board. In Atrahasis, the flood is not framed as moral judgment in the sense later readers might expect. We don't get a list of crimes. There is no long catalogue of violence, no speeches about corruption filling the earth. The stated motive is still framed in terms of disturbance. Humans are too many, too loud, too demanding. Their existence strains the comfort and authority of the high god who has to live with the consequences. To a Mesopotamian audience, that complaint would have made a certain kind of grim sense. Urban life in the 2nd millennium BCE was noisy markets, workshops, herds, processions. Temples were never truly quiet. The idea that the gods might be overwhelmed by the very density and energy of human civilization is a way of thinking about crowding, about the pressure of population on land and resources, without phrasing it in modern demographic terms. But the decision itself isn't unilateral. In this story world, big actions run through a council. Enlil convenes the assembly of the great gods again. What follows, in the lines scholars have been able to reconstruct, is not a debate about whether humans deserve annihilation. It's a discussion about whether the system can tolerate the cost of such a move. Some gods agree quickly. They share Enlil's irritation or simply defer to his authority. Others are uneasy. Enki especially has already invested himself in human survival. He helped design them. He has taught them rituals and technologies. He sees them not just as noisy labourers, but as partners in a delicate exchange. The council's dynamic is one of pressured consensus. We don't hear every dissenting voice. The tablets are broken, and even in their original form, the focus is on the outcome, not on a parliamentary transcript. But we see enough to know it wasn't unanimous enthusiasm. The flood decision emerges from tension, from a mix of agreement, fear, obligation, and resignation. To seal it, oaths are sworn. That detail matters. In Mesopotamian thought, divine oaths are binding even on the gods who swear them. Once the great gods have pledged themselves to the plan, backing out isn't just a change of mind, it's a violation of cosmic order. Enki is drawn into this. He is made to swear that he will not reveal the decision of the great gods to humanity, so the flood is born out of a council that half believes in it and half binds itself to it despite misgivings. It is a policy decision that becomes almost impossible to reverse once the signatures are on the document. Inside that, there is secrecy. Enlil is not interested in humans having a chance to adapt this time. The plague, the drought, the famine all left room for negotiation and technical fixes. This measure will come suddenly with no time for elaborate rituals or irrigation tricks. The plan is to keep it quiet until it's too late for anyone on Earth to respond. In some versions, Enlil explicitly forbids any god from warning a human. The council understands that the effectiveness of the flood depends on surprise. That alone tells us something about how the text imagines divine power. The gods are mighty, yes, but their success still depends on managing information. From our vantage point, the whole thing is morally murky. Is the flood a punishment? In one sense, yes. It's a response to a perceived offence, the noise of human life. But that offence is not moral depravity. It is success. Humans are guilty of being too good at surviving and multiplying in the conditions the gods arranged for them. Is it overreach? The story seems to think so, at least in retrospect. Later scenes will show gods panicking as the waters rise, regretting the scale of the destruction, going hungry for offerings. The flood turns out to be too much even for those who authorized it. They wanted a quieter world, not a dead one. Is it a cosmic reset? That's one way to read it. Atrahasis presents the flood as an attempt to roll back the consequences of earlier choices, to restore a simpler, less crowded Earth. But it's a reset that cannot fully succeed. Once you have invented human beings and bound your economy to their worship, you can't go back to a pre-human state without unmaking your own support system. Modern scholars looking at this decision often place it in a social and ecological frame. One line of interpretation treats the flood decree as a mythic reflection of real anxieties about population and limited agricultural land. Southern Mesopotamia was a place where irrigation agriculture could support dense settlements, but only if carefully managed. Over-irrigation led to salinization. Mismanaged canals could produce both drought and destructive local flooding. A story about gods trying to reduce numbers may echo a society's struggle to balance people, land, and water. Another approach sees the noise motif as a way of talking about class and control. The gods in Atrahasis resemble an elite landowning class, dependent on the labour of peasants, but irritated by their demands and visibility. The flood decision in this reading dramatizes an authoritarian fantasy. What if the ruling powers could clear out the troublesome masses and start fresh? The fact that the story ultimately critiques this move, showing its disastrous side effects, turns the fantasy inside out. There are even ecological readings that connect the sequence of plague, famine, drought, and flood to the real cyclical instabilities of the Tigris-Euphrates system. Years of low water and crop failure punctuated by catastrophic overflows. From that angle, the flood decree is not a single event, but a mythic compression of recurring stressors into one ultimate crisis. But it's important to keep the layers distinct. The text itself tells us that the reason for the flood in the story world is the clamour of humanity and the frustration of a high god whose policies have repeatedly failed. Everything else, the hints of irrigation crises, elite anxiety, demographic pressure, is interpretation. Plausible, often insightful, but still readings imposed on a 3,500-year-old narrative that never steps out of its own frame to explain itself in those terms. What we can say with some confidence is this: Atrahasis does not treat the flood as a simple act of righteous judgment. It presents it as the culmination of a flawed decision-making process among gods who are powerful but not omniscient, bound by their own oaths, caught between dependence on humans and irritation at them. That is the tension Enki now has to navigate. He has sworn not to reveal the plan. He refuses to endorse the annihilation of the beings he helped create. He is embedded in a divine bureaucracy that has just committed itself to a catastrophic policy. The question is, can you warn someone about a disaster without technically breaking your oath? The answer, in Atrahasis, is yes, but only if you're willing to get very creative about how you speak. And to whom? The surviving lines suggest that the warning doesn't arrive as a trumpet blast from heaven. It comes in the language of dreams. In Mesopotamian thought, dreams are a recognized communication channel. Not all dreams, of course. Ordinary people in ordinary times might have ordinary nonsense. But certain dreams, particularly those sent to kings, priests, and cult founders, were taken as messages from the divine realm. Atrahasis is precisely the kind of person who would attract that kind of attention. His very name, often glossed as exceedingly wise or extra wise, tells you how the story wants you to think of him. He's not the strongest or the loudest, he's the one who knows how to listen. So when the storm god's plan is ripening in secret, Atrahasis receives a disturbing night vision. The text here is damaged, but you can still catch glimpses, a house filling with water perhaps, the sound of rain that will not stop, a voice that speaks in fragments, ominous but unclear. He wakes unsettled. In some versions of the tradition, he goes to the temple, performs rites, tries to make sense of what he has seen. He suspects that something is wrong, but he doesn't yet know what. This is where Enki steps in, and also where Enki's oath gets in the way. Remember, he has sworn before the assembly that he will not reveal the decision of the great gods to mankind. He cannot simply appear in a blaze of light and tell Atrahasis, "A flood is coming, build a boat." That would be a direct violation of the oath, a frontal assault on the entire council's authority. But oaths in Mesopotamian legal culture are about wording. They are about what you say exactly and how you say it. They are not designed to anticipate every loophole a clever deity might imagine. Enki looks for a loophole. In the Akkadian text, his solution is both literal and weirdly charming. Rather than address Atrahasis directly, he addresses an inanimate object associated with him, often translated as a wall of reed, or reed fence, or house wall. The line goes something like wall, wall, reed wall, reed wall. Listen to me, on the surface. This is absurd. Walls do not have ears. But in the logic of the story, and in the logic of oath-keeping, it's brilliant. Enki can say truthfully that he did not reveal the decision to a human. He revealed it to a wall. If a human happened to be on the other side of that wall, overhearing every word, that's a different matter. The text then has Enki pour out the warning in carefully coded instruction. He doesn't say Enlil will send a flood because he is angry. He says, in effect, abandon your house, build a boat, reject possessions and save life. Make the craft roofed, seal it well, take aboard the seed of living things. Different tablets preserve different bits of this speech, but the pattern is clear. Enki supplies technical details, dimensions, materials, sealing techniques, and strategic information, what to load, who to bring, without ever explicitly naming the decree he is technically forbidden to disclose. It's a little like a lawyer explaining to a client what will happen if a certain law is enforced, while very carefully not revealing confidential deliberations behind that law. The warning is real, life-saving, and yet formally indirect. This scene sits right at the fault line between two impulses in the story, obedience and compassion. On one side, you have the divine council's decree, backed by sworn oaths and the prestige of high gods. On the other, you have Enki's attachment to humanity, to this particular human, and to the fragile economy of offerings and rituals that depends on people not being wiped out entirely. Enki's workaround lets him honour both, at least on paper. He does not openly defy Enlil. He does not break his oath in the most literal sense. But he also does not sit quietly and watch the beings he has nurtured disappear. The result is a kind of theological compromise. Fate, in the big picture sense, remains intact. The flood will still come. The decree will still be carried out. The world will still be devastated. But within that fixed frame, there is space for individual agency. Atrahasis will know enough to act. He will not be able to stop the flood, but he can position himself and a small cargo of life on the right side of it. The warning scene, then, doesn't present fate as a rigid script where every detail is locked. It presents fate as a broad outcome. There will be a flood within which clever actors, divine and human, can still maneuver. Atrahasis has to decide whether to trust the coded message. From his point of view, this is not a trivial choice. Obeying Enki means leaving his house, his property, his social position. It means becoming, very suddenly, a builder of impossibly large boats in a world that is not yet raining. His neighbours, in later retellings of similar stories, are sometimes imagined as mocking him. The original Atrahasis tablet doesn't indulge in that kind of dramatization, but it does assume a cost. You don't build an ark in secret. In that sense, the dream and the wall whisper create a test of perception. Atrahasis has to recognize an indirect message as urgent truth. Enki has to trust that the human he has chosen is capable of reading between the lines. Scholars sometimes point out that this pattern, divine warning in oblique form, a hero who gets it, and a rescue that doesn't cancel the catastrophe but survives through it, shows up again and again in Near Eastern literature. When you turn to the later flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, Utnapishti, a clear literary cousin of Atrahasis, receives almost the same style of warning. Ea, another name for Enki, speaks again to a reed wall. Reed wall, listen. He again instructs the hero to tear down his house, build a boat, lie to his city about why he's doing it. The same legalistic dodge of the oath appears, as if this trick has become part of Ea's narrative personality. By the time you reach the Hebrew Bible story of Noah, the device has shifted. There, WHWH speaks directly to Noah, without the intermediary fiction of a wall. The God in Genesis is not bound by a council's oath in quite the same way, and the text is less interested in divine legal cleverness. The emphasis moves from coded communication to explicit command and obedience. God said to Noah, and Noah does all that God commanded him. The pattern of a warned hero building a boat stays, but the indirection largely disappears. Even so, some readers see an echo of the older motif in the way Noah is singled out, in his reputation for righteousness that makes him the kind of person a god might choose as a partner in survival. The idea that not everyone hears or heeds the warning is shared, even if the mechanics of the warning have changed. Other flood traditions in the region keep elements of the Atrahasis pattern in different proportions. Some Sumerian versions have a direct dream from a god, with less emphasis on loopholes and more on urgency. Hittite and Hurrian materials hint at catastrophes averted or mitigated through divine hints sent to specialists who know how to interpret them. Across these retellings, one thing stays remarkably consistent. The flood rarely arrives completely unannounced. Someone is tipped off. The gods, even when furious or exasperated, almost never shut the door on all survival. There is usually a crack, an ambiguous dream, a whispered word to a wall, a god who quietly colour violates the spirit of an order while maintaining its formal letter. That consistency tells us something about how these cultures thought about disaster and responsibility. Total blind annihilation is not the preferred model. Catastrophe is terrible, but it is also framed as something that the wise might see coming, that the attentive might prepare for, that the compassionate might help others endure. Divine power may set the parameters of the crisis, but within those parameters, human decision-making still matters. In Atrahasis, that sliver of agency is narrow but vital. A man listens to a dream, eavesdrops on a conversation with a wall, and decides to act. A god binds himself with an oath, then twists his own language just enough to keep a promise he never formally made, that he will not let his creatures perish without a chance. The boat has not yet been built, the rains have not yet begun, but the future is already shifting subtly, because of how a message is framed and how a listener responds. Next, the text turns from words to wood, from legal finesse and symbolic communication to timber, pitch, measurements, and the gritty logistics of trying to ride out the end of the world in something you built with your own hands. The moment Enki starts talking about timber and pitch, the story steps into a different kind of imagination. Up to now, you've been in the realm of dreams, oaths, and loopholes. Now you're suddenly dealing with beams, planks, and cubits. It's as if the poem is saying, yes, this is myth, but myths still need working hinges. The surviving Atrahasis tablets give us only a fragmented view of the boat instructions. Some lines are perfectly clear. Others trail off into gaps where the clay has flaked away, leaving tantalizing half-words and empty space. What we do have across Atrahasis and its very close cousin in the Epic of Gilgamesh is a recognizable pattern. Enki tells Atrahasis to abandon the normal logic of a householder. Tear down your house, he says in some versions. Use the materials of your dwelling to construct the thing that will let you keep dwelling in the world. It's a powerful reversal. Your home must die so that you don't. The craft itself is described with a set of stock terms. It is roofed, it is sealed, it is like the Apsu, the subterranean waters, or like a great boat. It has multiple decks or levels. It is to be made strong as the firmament, a simile that signals both size and solidity. In some lines we see words for specific materials: wood, reeds, pitch, or bitumen. In Mesopotamia, that last ingredient is very real. Natural bitumen seeped from the ground in the region. It was used to waterproof baskets, bricks, and actual boats. When the tablet says to coat it inside and out with pitch, that's not fantasy. That's standard ancient engineering advice. Other words point to carpentry. There are terms that can be glossed as beams, ribs, planking, pegs, commands to fasten, bind together, secure the joints. Even though the details are broken, the overall impression is not of a miraculous vehicle conjured by a god, but a human-built structure following very familiar building logic. Where things get trickier is with measurements. In Atrahasis itself, the exact dimensions of the boat are badly damaged. Scholars can see that numbers and units once stood in those spots, but in many cases the numerals are gone, or only the tops of a few wedge marks remain. You can tell the scribe was interested in size and proportion. You can't always tell what those proportions were. Later, in the flood story embedded in Gilgamesh, we get a clearer, almost obsessive specification. There, Utnapishti's boat is square. Its length and width are each 120 cubits. It has 7 decks, 9 compartments per deck, and absurdly thick walls. The text revels in these details, as if piling up measurements were a way of proving seriousness. Some scholars think the Atrahasis flood narrative originally contained similar numbers and that the Gilgamesh poet simply transferred and polished them. Others suspect that Gilgamesh is engaging in a kind of literary one-upmanship, inflating and regularizing the dimensions to make the arc feel even more monumental and orderly than in its source. Either way, by the time you come back to Atrahasis and look at its patchy lines, you have a problem. Do you let the gaps stay gaps, or do you repair them with numbers borrowed from other flood texts? Different editions make different choices. This is where modern philology starts to look a little like ancient boat building. You have an underlying framework, the surviving pieces of Atrahasis itself. You have other sources, Gilgamesh tablets, stray mentions in later Akkadian, Sumerian flood myths that might supply missing planks. The question is how much you dare to fill in. Responsible scholars tend to mark their joins. In printed editions and translations, you'll often see brackets or dots where the clay is damaged. A number in brackets, 120 cubits, usually signals that the editor thinks that's what used to be there, but can't prove it. Some reconstructions stay very cautious, leaving entire lines as X cubits long, X cubits wide, and simply noting in commentary that Gilgamesh has 120 in those slots. Others are bolder, arguing that the flood stories share a common scribal tradition and that missing figures can reasonably be supplied. But even then, you'll find long footnotes explaining the decision, alternative readings, and the possibility that a future fragment could overturn the guess. When popular books or online articles talk about the exact dimensions of Atrahasis's boat, They are often quietly importing those numbers from Gilgamesh and smoothing over the uncertainty. It makes for a neat diagram, but it's not quite honest to the clay. The safest way to talk about the Atrahasis vessel is in broad strokes. It is big enough to carry a household, servants, craftsmen, perhaps animals and supplies. It is multi-storied, a floating stacked house. It is overbuilt, heavily caulked, designed not for speed but for endurance. Beyond that, our exactness dissolves into ranges and probabilities. You can also ask how much of this reflects real Mesopotamian boat technology. We know from other texts and from archaeology that people in southern Mesopotamia used at least two relevant types of watercraft. One was the reed boat, bundles of reeds lashed together, coated with bitumen to keep them watertight. These could be surprisingly sturdy and were common on marshes and slow rivers. They are still made in parts of Iraq and Iran today. The other was the wooden river barge or round boat, sometimes called a coracle, a framework of wood or wicker, again sealed with pitch. These were used to move heavy goods along the Euphrates and Tigris, grain, timber, stone. The Atrahasis boat, with its emphasis on sealing and its mention of reeds alongside timber, seems to be an idealized hybrid. Part giant reed barge, part wooden house. The technology is not alien to the time. It's a familiar toolbox taken to a mythic extreme. At the same time, some of the design features feel more literary than practical. A perfectly square vessel, if Atrahasis shared that with Gilgamesh, is hydrodynamically awkward. A 7-decker with monstrous walls would be horrendously heavy. Modern naval architects who have tried to model the Gilgamesh Ark on computers tend to come back with raised eyebrows and caveats. Yes, you might get it to float, but it would be a nightmare to steer, and the stresses on the structure would be enormous. But that may be precisely the point. The boat in Atrahasis is not supposed to be nimble. It is not a trading ship. It is a sealed chest meant to ride chaos until the gods relent. From that point of view, exaggeration and symmetry, the 7 decks, the equal sides, the massive thickness, signal completeness and cosmic order. This is a world in miniature, squared and stacked, withdrawing into itself while the outside world is unmade. The poem also hints, briefly, at the social reality of such a project. Earlier, you heard that you don't build an ark in secret. Atrahasis is instructed to abandon his possessions to gather life. He cannot personally fell every tree, drag every beam, heat every batch of bitumen. Even in a myth, somebody has to swing the hammers. Other Mesopotamian building texts, especially those about temples and city walls, routinely mention conscripted labour, teams of carpenters, overseers, and provisioners. It is reasonable to imagine that the Atrahasis audience, hearing a command to build an enormous boat, mentally filled in the same cast. Kin, hired workers, maybe even state labour, if Atrahasis is imagined as a man of status. That raises another question. Who knew? Did the workers understand that they were building a refuge from a divine extermination? Or did Atrahasis, as Utnapishti later does in Gilgamesh, offer a more mundane cover story? In the Gilgamesh version, Ea explicitly tells the hero to lie. Tell the city you are building a boat because you have offended Enlil and are leaving to live with him. Say that the gods will rain bread and wheat instead of water. The people will think you are crazy or ambitious, not that the end of the world is scheduled for next week. Atrahasis does not preserve that precise speech, but since the two narratives are so tightly related, many scholars suspect a similar dynamic. The boat becomes a social disturbance. Rumours spread. Neighbours see resources being diverted, perhaps feel betrayed or abandoned. Even if the tablets don't spell it out, the emotional and economic shockwaves are part of what makes the story feel grounded in human life. From a literary standpoint, the construction sequence also gives the god a chance to keep watching. Enki has set this plan in motion through a wall. Now he observes whether Atrahasis follows through. Each step, cutting wood, shaping the hull, sealing the seams, becomes a test of trust. The text, sparse as it is, leans on repetition. He did as his Lord commanded. The emphasis is not on technical innovation, but on obedience carried into practice. Behind the scenes, modern scholars are engaged in a parallel act of construction. They gather broken tablets from library rooms in ancient cities like Ashur and Nineveh. They compare different copies of the Atrahasis story, each with its own spelling quirks and missing chunks. They consult lexical lists, ancient Mesopotamian dictionaries, to decide whether a certain term should be read as beam, pole, or side. When two manuscripts diverge, they have to choose. Does this copy's shorter line indicate a damaged exemplar, or did the scribe deliberately simplify? When Gilgamesh and Atrahasis give slightly different boat instructions, is that evolution over time, or just the flexible habits of poets who never expected their work to be collated by 21st century academics? Those questions mean that any confident statement about the Atrahasis arc should come with a mental asterisk. There is not one single fixed blueprint hiding behind the tablets. There is a cluster of related traditions transmitted and reshaped over centuries, all circling the same core image, a hero building an impossibly thorough boat under divine instruction. If you keep that in mind, the debate over exact dimensions becomes less about arguing over the size of an imaginary ship, and more about listening carefully to what the text is trying to accomplish. It wants you to feel the weight of the task, the smell of pitch, the strangeness of turning your house into a hull, the tension between the ordinary skills of carpenters and the extraordinary scale of the job. It wants you to sense that survival in this story is not just a blessing dropped from the sky. It is labour, it is logistics, it is the reorganisation of a life, of many lives, around a whispered hint that the world as you know it is about to end. Once the last seam is sealed and the cargo is brought aboard, the text will let go of measurements and materials. The focus will shift again, from wood and bitumen back to wind and water, from the logic of construction to the logic of catastrophe. When it does, the boat Atrahasis has built will become what it was always meant to be, a tiny, stubborn pocket of order floating on the surface of divine rage. When the text finally lets the storm loose, it does so with a kind of grim satisfaction. All that careful carpentry, all the measuring and sealing, suddenly sits in the background like a held breath. The centre of gravity shifts upward, into the sky, into the gods' tempers, and the strange physics of a world coming apart. In Atrahasis, as in later Mesopotamian flood stories, the onset is abrupt. One day the boat is being provisioned, the next the weather has slipped its leash. The clouds mass. The lines speak of a storm god roaring, of the horizon disappearing. Thunder isn't just noise, it's described as the battle cry of the divine assembly. Lightning is not a natural discharge, it is the god Adad raging in the clouds, hurling weapons. Darkness is one of the poem's favourite tools. The day is said to turn black. The tablet describes a kind of layered night, clouds stacked on clouds, rain veils beneath them, spray rising so thick that the boundary between sky and water dissolves. It is not just dim, it is disorientation pushed to the point where one man no longer sees another. That phrase, or ones like it, show up in several Mesopotamian storm texts. It is a shorthand for social reality breaking down. You cannot see your neighbour, your kin, the person whose hand you would normally grab when danger comes. The weather has cut the threads that bind you to others. The water itself is not gentle rain. It comes in sheets, driven by wind that is described as demonic. The cuneiform signs for storm and evil wind are close cousins. The poet leans into that. The flood is not merely too much water in the wrong place. It is the atmosphere turned hostile, the breath of the gods weaponized. Other lines suggest that the very architecture of the cosmos is under strain. The Mesopotamian universe is often pictured as a set of stacked layers, the earth like a disk, the heavens arching above like a dome, the Apsu, the subterranean freshwaters below. In the flood sequence, these separations blur. The sluices of heaven are opened, the fountains of the deep respond. The result is a kind of vertical confusion. Water from above meets water from below, and the solid layer in between where humans live is temporarily erased. It's important that this is described less like a local river bursting its banks and more like a cosmic plumbing failure. That scale matters for what comes next, the reaction of the gods themselves. You might expect unshakable resolve. The decision has been made. The orders have gone out, the storm has been called up like an army. But once the flood is actually underway, the tablets let you see something more fragile. The lesser gods and even some of the great ones are suddenly afraid. In Atrahasis, there are famous lines where the gods cower like dogs and clinging to the outer wall of heaven. That simile is not flattering. It strips the divines of their usual calm distance and shows them scrambling, huddling, trying to get away from the very forces they unleashed. The goddess who had been involved in creating humans, often identified with Mami, or Belatili, laments loudly. She cries that she gave birth to these people, that they are her offspring, and now they are being swept away. Her speech, in the fragments we have, mixes maternal grief with shock. She seems genuinely surprised at the scale of the destruction. Enlil, the storm-wielding god who pushed hardest for the flood, is not pictured weeping. But there are hints of unease even around him. Later lines and parallel texts suggest a dawning awareness that the remedy has overshot the disease. The noise of humanity has been silenced, yes, but so have their offerings, their labour, their role in the divine economy. The text plays this as a slow realization. At first, the flood is the execution of policy. As hours and days pass, it becomes something else, an event no longer fully under control. The gods cannot simply snap their fingers and stop the deluge. They have to wait it out, watching as the creation they argued over for tablets, and tablets is unmade in a handful of lines. While all of this plays out in the heights, Atrahasis and the people with him are inside a box. The poem gives only glimpses of their experience, but they are sharp. There are references to the noise of the storm battering the hull, to the boat being tossed like a reed, to those on board crouching, unable to stand. The ark is less a vessel in motion and more a sealed room being shaken. You can imagine the creaking timbers, the pitch weeping in its seams, the stench of fear and animals and too many bodies locked in too little space. When the text notes that the great wind flattened the land, it is not just describing an external scene, it is telling you what the people inside cannot see but can infer. They feel the relentless motion, the lurching that tells them there is no longer ground beneath them. They hear things snapping, collapsing, being carried past. The world outside has become a noise. In that sense, the flood narrative functions as an early attempt to give literary shape to trauma. It does not linger on individual psychology. You do not get inner monologues from Atrahasis or his family. But you do get bodily impressions, the loss of orientation, the forced confinement, the sense that the normal rules have been suspended and no one can say when or whether they will return. Later ancient texts that deal with catastrophe, wars, plagues, city sacks often use similar devices. They turn events into sensory overload, darkness at noon, ground shaking, people unable to recognize familiar streets. Atrahasis sits near the start of that trajectory, taking an ultimate disaster and rendering it as an atmosphere you can almost feel pressing on your skin. This storm is not created in a vacuum. It belongs to a wider Near Eastern tradition in which weather is the main instrument of divine power. Across Mesopotamia, the Levant and Anatolia, storm gods are frontline figures. Adad in Mesopotamia, Baal in Ugarit, Tarhunt in Hittite myth, all rule with thunder, rain and wind. Their victories are often told in the language of tempests. Enemies are scattered like chaff before a gale, mountains melt under their lightning. The Atrahasis flood takes that familiar image and stretches it to a limit case. Instead of a storm that defeats a rival god or a rebellious city, this is a storm that targets humanity as a category. The same imagery, raging clouds, crashing waters, the sky growling like a lion, is repurposed. What was once a sign of protection for one city and threat to its enemies becomes, in the flood, an indiscriminate scythe. You can see faint resonances with other traditions too. Later Hebrew poetry will describe the sea as a rebellious force, YHWH must curb, storms as his chariot. Canaanite myths speak of Yam, the sea, whom Baal must subdue. In all these, weather is not just background, it is the theatre in which cosmic order is asserted or lost. So what is the flood in Atrahasis? Is it an event or a metaphor? The safest answer is both. On one level, the poem clearly imagines a concrete happening. There is a particular time when the waters begin, a measured duration of the storm, a moment when everything dries and the boat comes to rest. The narrative treats it as a once-for-all disaster within its own timeline. At the same time, the language the poet chooses pushes the story into symbolic terrain. Darkness that cancels recognition, water that erases boundaries, gods who regret their own decisions, these are not just features of bad weather. They are images of social and cosmic breakdown. The flood becomes a way of talking about what happens when the structures that usually hold violence and chaos in check are opened too far. For an audience living on floodplains, who knew very well what ordinary inundation looked like, that layering would have been obvious. Real rivers rise and fall, real storms kill people and ruin crops. But this flood, the flood is all of those fears inflated until they touch the ceiling of the universe. It is, in effect, a story about limit, what happens when divine frustration is allowed to run to its absolute extreme, and what it feels like to be small and fragile inside that choice. Later, when the waters recede and the gods gather again, the poem will step back from that edge. It will start asking how to keep such an unmaking from ever happening in quite that way again. For now, in the thick of the deluge, it wants you to sit with the sensation of total exposure. The world has become water and wind. The gods huddle, the humans crouch, and a single overbuilt boat hangs between annihilation and whatever new arrangement might be waiting on the other side of the storm. At some point the noise thins. Ancient texts do not usually give you weather reports in hours and minutes. They speak in broader strokes. The storm raged for 7 days and 7 nights in some versions. In others the exact length is damaged or varies. What matters is that there is a before, an unbearable middle, and then an after. The after begins in silence. The boat stops moving the way it had been. There are still waves, still currents, but the sense of being flung about like a piece of straw eases. The text gestures at a moment when Atrahasis dares to open something, often a window, a hatch, some aperture in that sealed box, and look out. What he sees is not a shoreline, it is an absence. Bodies of people and animals float in the water. The land, where there is any, is flattened, scrubbed clean of buildings and trees. In some parallel flood stories you get lists of cities that are gone, temples that no longer stand. Atrahasis is more impressionistic. It suggests a landscape that has been wiped down to first principles. Survival in that first moment is disorienting. The people on the boat are alive, but they have no world to plug back into. Their kin networks, their villages, their fields, their routines, all of the invisible structures that made sense of daily life, have been dissolved. The poem doesn't spell out their conversations. It lets the emptiness speak for them. And then, almost immediately, it pivots to something that a Mesopotamian audience would have expected, as instinctively as breathing: sacrifice. As the waters continue to recede and the boat comes to rest, mountains are usually involved here, distant highlands that poke up through the thinning flood. Atrahasis leaves the ark and offers a sacrifice. Later flood traditions will give you specifics: altars, clean animals, careful lists of what gets burned. Atrahasis in the surviving fragments is briefer. But the basic picture is familiar. A fire is kindled. Animals are slaughtered and arranged. Smoke begins to rise. To modern readers, this can feel like an odd narrative choice. You just survived the end of the world. Wouldn't you start by scouting for food, water, shelter? In Mesopotamian religious logic, this is food and this is shelter. Sacrifices in these texts are not primarily about giving things up in a moral sense. They are about feeding the gods, maintaining the proper flow of goods and gratitude between heaven and earth. Grain, beer, incense, fat from animals, all of it is presented, burned, and turned into smoke and smell. That smell is described as pleasing, sweet, soothing to the gods. Atrahasis leans into that sensory metaphor. The gods, who have spent the duration of the flood without human offerings, are pictured as starving. They gather like flies over the sacrifice. One famous line says in a parallel text, "It is not a dignified image. These are not distant, self-sufficient beings serenely accepting homage. They are hungry, crowding close to the rising aroma the way insects swarm a carcass." Some scholars read this hunger as a direct reflection of temple economics. In real cities, priests tended daily offerings that were believed to sustain the gods. Temples were granaries, butcheries, breweries. If humanity as a whole were wiped out, that entire support system would vanish. The scene of the gods converging on Atrahasis's first post-flood offering in this view is theology observing that the divine realm is not independent of the human. Others see it more symbolically. The hunger, they argue, dramatizes dependence and regret. The gods thought they could do without humans. Confronted with a quiet, foodless universe, they discover they cannot. The sacrifice is not just a meal, it is proof that the old channels between worlds can be reopened. Either way, the tone around this altar is very different from the tone around the council that ordered the flood. There, the gods were irritated, officious, concerned about noise and crowding and cosmic housekeeping. Here they are chastened. The creator goddess, Mami Belet Ili, who had wept during the storm, now has leverage. She can point to the altar, to the thin line of smoke, and say, "This is what you almost lost." Not just labour, not just population, but relationship. A world in which the gods receive honour, attention, sustenance. Enlil, the instigator of the flood, is forced into a kind of bargaining posture. He is not removed from power. These are not myths in which the storm god is overthrown for his mistake. But there is a sense that he has to be reined in, balanced, talked down from his previous extremes. Other gods, often Enki Ea, the clever one who had helped Atrahasis survive, speak up. They argue that total annihilation was a blunder. You can feel the emotional temperature shift from rage to negotiation. Remorse is not portrayed as a warm, fuzzy confession. It shows up as institutional self-correction. The gods realize that wiping out humanity endangers their own comfort and status. The language of regret is tied to concrete loss. No cult, no offerings, no bustling cities whose noise, for all its irritation, was also proof that the cosmic machine was running. Around the fire, a new settlement is hammered out. Instead of ending the human project, the gods decide to modify it. The flood becomes a one-time event, a reference point. On this side of it, new rules will apply. The next section of the poem, in the fragments that survive, moves into measures about mortality, fertility, and social limits, ways of keeping human numbers, and by implication human noise, within bounds without resorting to universal drowning. That's the structural importance of this quiet, smoky scene. It resets the relationship between gods and humans from one of unilateral creation and disposal to one of negotiated interdependence. Humans will still serve the gods. They will still work, build, offer. But their existence is now implicitly guaranteed, within limits as necessary to the functioning of the divine world. From a narrative perspective, the sacrifice marks the pivot from catastrophe to order. Before the altar, the flood feels like pure unmaking, a divine tantrum stretched over days. After the altar, the story begins to lay down boundaries again. Who may live, how long, under what terms. The gods, drawn by hunger and regret to the smell of burning meat, are coaxed into making promises. The waters have receded, but the memory of what it felt like when they didn't will linger in those promises, and in the fragile new balance they are meant to protect. What emerges from that bargaining is not a rainbow in the sky or a simple never again pledge. It is policy, in the closing part of Atrahasis at least, in the parts we can still read. The gods outline concrete measures designed to keep the human problem from getting out of hand again. They are not subtle about the goal. They want labour, sacrifice, a noisy but manageable human presence. They do not want another world so crowded, so relentless, that Enlil feels driven back to the flood option. So they do what any bureaucracy might do when faced with a population issue. They change the rules around life and birth. One strand of this new settlement is mortality. Earlier in the story, especially in the creation scenes, humans are imagined as potentially long-lived, vigorous, able to pile up generations in a way that unnerves the gods. After the flood, that possibility is trimmed back. The text speaks of establishing death and of fixing the human lifespan. The exact numbers are not always clear. The tablets are broken, and different versions phrase it differently. But the sense is that humans will no longer drift towards semi-divine longevity. They will age, they will weaken, they will die at a rate that keeps the total population below some invisible red line. In other words, the flood doesn't just wipe the slate clean, it redraws the curve. It is as if the gods are looking at a chart, births rising, deaths falling, total numbers climbing like a steep hill, and deciding to adjust the parameters. If you can't stand the noise at 1 million humans, you don't let the line climb to 1 million again. You set a cap by making individual lives shorter, more fragile. Alongside this, the poem introduces a second lever: fertility. If mortality puts a ceiling on how long people can stay in the system, fertility determines how many enter it. The post-flood settlement doesn't leave births entirely to chance. It introduces constraints. Some lines mention women seized by a demon or the ghost of the dead, language many scholars think reflects a mythic explanation for stillbirths, infant mortality, or unexplained infertility. Others speak more systematically. There will be women who are taboo, women assigned to special roles who will not bear children at all. This is where priestesses come in. One late version of the story, related to Atrahasis, but preserved in a different context, explicitly lists categories of women, priestesses of particular ranks and functions, who are not to give birth. Their sexuality is not denied, but their reproductive capacity is taken off the table. In the logic of the myth, the gods create institutional roles that channel desire without multiplying mouths. How literally should we take that? Here the interpretive debates begin. Some historians see in this a reflection of real Mesopotamian practice. We know from other texts that certain temple women, especially high-ranking priestesses attached to major deities, were not expected to have conventional families. Their status, income and ritual duties defined them, not their children. For those scholars, Atrahasis is mythologizing an existing social arrangement, turning a familiar institution into a cosmic safety valve. Others are more cautious. They point out that the lines about barren women, demon-caused miscarriages, and childless priestesses are part of a divine speech, a kind of legal decree spoken in mythic time. That doesn't necessarily mean anyone on the ground in old Babylonian cities sat down to design their family structures this way. It might be that the myth uses recognizable figures, priests, midwives, sacred prostitutes, as symbols in a larger thought experiment about how the gods could regulate human numbers. Either way, the poem is doing something ambitious. It is tying together three levels of reality: the cosmic, the demographic, and the everyday. At the cosmic level, this is about balance. The gods are trying to keep the world in a state where their needs are met. Temples staffed, altars busy, cities active, without tipping over into the kind of overcrowding and constant clamour that sparked Enlil's rage. The measures around lifespan and fertility are essentially tools for preserving that balance, levers in a divine feedback system. At the demographic level, the anxiety is familiar. Too many people chasing too few resources, fields that cannot yield enough grain, rivers that cannot irrigate enough land, herds that cannot grow fast enough to feed the burgeoning masses. The flood is the extreme mythical version of famine and plague. The post-flood settlement is the fantasy of control, of being able to fine-tune births and deaths so that catastrophe never becomes necessary. And at the everyday level, these cosmic decisions map onto personal suffering. When the text talks about demons snatching away infants, about women who cannot conceive, about designated childless priestesses, it is reaching into experiences that must have haunted ancient households. Miscarriage, crib death, unexplained infertility. These were not abstract statistics. They were nights of weeping, marriages under strain, lineages that failed. By framing those sorrows as part of a divine program to prevent another flood, Atrahasis gives them a kind of meaning. It is not a comforting meaning in the modern sense. The gods are not portrayed as gentle shepherds guiding each life with tender concern. They are managers trying to optimize a system. But for a Mesopotamian audience, the idea that your child's death or your own inability to conceive was not random but folded into the cosmic balance might have made it more bearable, or at least more legible. This is where the myth exposes its deepest anxieties. Beneath the story of noisy humans and irritated gods lies a world that feels perpetually precarious. Crops fail, epidemics sweep through, invading armies burn fields and carry people off. The line between order and chaos is thin. Atrahasis does not promise to remove that precariousness. It ritualizes it. Mortality is not a tragic afterthought. It is built into the contract. Infertility is not just misfortune, it is one of the tools holding back another universal disaster. Social roles that limit reproduction are not accidents. They are part of the architecture the gods use to keep everything from collapsing again. For us, reading this thousands of years later, it is tempting to treat the end of Atrahasis as a window, straight into historical policy, as if we could draw direct lines from the tablet's decrees to census records and law codes. The reality is murkier. We can say that the myth reflects concerns that were real: overflowing cities, strained irrigation systems, the pain of child loss, the existence of celibate or semi-celibate religious roles. We cannot say with confidence that anyone in Babylon sat down and said, "We have too many people, therefore let us enforce the Atrahasis rules." What the text does give us, with surprising clarity, is a picture of how one ancient culture thought about control. Not just control over rivers and fields, but control over birth and death themselves. A recognition that you cannot have an orderly, sustainable human world without limits, and that those limits will always be paid for in individual grief. In the next section, when we put Atrahasis side by side with the biblical story of Noah, these differences in emphasis on population management versus moral judgment, on cosmic noise versus human wickedness, will become even sharper. For now, the tablet leaves us with a world in which the flood is over. The waters have gone, but the memory of drowning lives on in every grave and every empty cradle. If you grew up with the story of Noah, a lot of what Atrahasis does is going to feel eerily familiar. There is a chosen survivor. Not because he's perfect in a moral sense, but because he is, in some versions, particularly wise, particularly attentive to the gods, particularly close to Enki, Ea, the deity who decides humanity should not be wiped out entirely. There is a warning. In Atrahasis it comes disguised and circuitous, because the gods have sworn oaths to keep their plan secret. Enki talks to a wall, or to the reed fence of Atrahasis' house, so he can technically say he did not break his promise while still getting the message through. In Genesis, the warning is direct. God speaks straight to Noah. No legal workarounds, no coded speeches to building materials. There is a boat. In both stories, the hero is told to build something well beyond the scale of everyday life. There are dimensions, instructions, sealing with bitumen to keep out the water. The vessel is not a fishing skiff or a river barge. It is a floating world. There are animals. Atrahasis takes on board the seed of all living things, language that resonates closely with the biblical idea of preserving animal kinds, pairs or sevens of clean and unclean beasts. In both stories, the Ark becomes a mobile zoo, a genetic backup to reboot life once the waters fall. There is the flood itself, a storm that is not just bad weather, but cosmic unmaking. In Atrahasis and its close cousin, the flood episode in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the descriptions are furious. Roaring like a bull, darkness, sheets of water that erase cities. In Genesis, the language is more measured, but the scale is the same. All the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. And there is the sacrifice when it's over. In Atrahasis, and in Gilgamesh's later retelling, the moment the boat grounds and the hero steps out, he builds an altar and burns offerings. The smell rises, and the gods, who have been fasting through the destruction, gather like flies over the sacrifice. In Genesis, Noah also leaves the ark, builds an altar, and offers burnt offerings from the clean animals he brought with him. God smells the pleasing aroma and responds with a pledge about the future of the earth. Parallel after parallel, like beads on a string. For many readers, it is hard not to look at this and think, these are not just random similarities. Something is going on, but then the differences come into focus, and they are just as striking. We've seen that in Atrahasis. The core problem is quantity and noise. Humans are too many, too loud, too disruptive to divine comfort. The flood is not punishment for crimes, it is a violent reset of an overburdened system. When the gods rethink things afterward, their solution is about population management, not moral reform. In Genesis, the diagnosis is different. The earth is full of violence. Human hearts are bent on evil. The reason given for the flood is not that people are too numerous or irritating, but that they are corrupt. The flood is a judgment, not a noise complaint, that shapes the way each story imagines what comes after. In Atrahasis, the post-flood settlement is technical. Shorter lifespans, institutionalized infertility, categories of women who will not bear children. The goal is to keep human numbers within acceptable limits, so the gods are not again tempted to extreme measures. In Genesis, the post-flood world is framed as a covenant. God promises never again to destroy all life with a flood. There are conditions, prohibitions on shedding blood, rules about eating meat, but they are presented within a relationship, a binding pledge between God, Noah, his descendants, and even the animals. The rainbow is a sign of that relationship, not a demographic policy. The divine character also shifts. Mesopotamian gods in Atrahasis are plural, rivalrous, often short-sighted. Some regret the flood as it's happening, not because it was unjust, but because their supply of offerings has dried up. Enki Ea comes off as clever and sympathetic but constrained by the oaths and politics of the divine council. The god of Genesis is singular, sovereign, not bound by the same kind of intergod deals. There is regret there too. It grieved him to his heart. But the regret is about violence and corruption, not about missed meals. The post-flood promise is rooted in mercy and patience, a commitment to endure human waywardness rather than reset the board every time. Even the hero is framed differently. Atrahasis is the wise, pious human who benefits from his patron deity's decision to bend the rules. He is saved because he listens well and acts quickly, but nothing in the surviving text tells us he is uniquely righteous compared to his neighbours. Noah, by contrast, is singled out as righteous and blameless in his generation. His survival is explicitly tied to moral standing. The story invites you to see him not just as lucky or well-connected, but as chosen for his character. When you put all of this together, a question naturally follows. How are these stories related? Scholars tend to talk about three broad possibilities, and they are not mutually exclusive. One is shared cultural background. Floods on major river systems are a recurring fact of life in Mesopotamia. Tigris and Euphrates floods can be abrupt, devastating, city-wrecking. It would be surprising if multiple cultures living in and around that environment did not develop big flood stories. In this view, Atrahasis and Noah are tapping into a common reservoir of memory and imagery, boats, animals, a favoured survivor, without one needing to copy the other line by line. A second possibility is more direct literary influence. We know the Atrahasis flood episode was reused in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Tablet 11 of Gilgamesh is essentially a refitted version of the Atrahasis flood, with the hero renamed Utnapishti. That text, in turn, was widely copied in the first millennium BCE, including in cities and languages that overlap with the world of ancient Israel. Some scholars imagine a chain, Old Sumerian and Akkadian flood traditions condensed in Atrahasis, recycled in Gilgamesh, then encountered in exilic or post-exilic Babylonia by Judean scribes, who shaped the Genesis narrative in conscious conversation with them, echoing motifs but transforming their meaning. A third angle emphasizes independent reworking of widespread motifs. Even if Israelite authors had heard Mesopotamian stories, they may not have been borrowing in the sense of simple adaptation. Instead, they might have been engaging in what we could call mythic argument, taking a recognizable pattern. A god warns a man, a boat is built, life is saved, and using it as a vehicle to say something quite different about who God is, what human evil means, and how judgment and mercy work. This is where the Gilgamesh version becomes especially important as a bridge, because we can see on the clay tablets themselves how one Mesopotamian tradition reuses another. The flood speech in Gilgamesh shares whole lines with Atrahasis. Utnapishti's boat specifications, the release of birds to test the waters, the sacrifice and the god's hungry reaction. It's all there, reshaped for a new epic about mortality and the search for eternal life. So we have a clear example of later authors in Mesopotamia mining an earlier flood myth, modifying it and embedding it in a new narrative frame. That makes it easier for some scholars to imagine something similar happening again, across cultural lines, as Israelite scribes living under Babylonian power encountered and reinterpreted those stories. But here is where caution comes in. Atrahasis, in the form we know it, is Old Babylonian, around the early 2nd millennium BCE. The standardized Gilgamesh flood tablet is later, most copies coming from the 1st millennium. The final literary shape of Genesis 6:9 also belongs, in most reconstructions, somewhere in that broad 1st millennium window, with roots and sources that may be older. Between these texts lie centuries of oral tradition, lost writings, local variants we no longer possess. We have snapshots, not a continuous film. That means we can say with confidence that similar motifs existed in the region long before the Hebrew Bible took shape. We can say that Mesopotamian flood stories were richly developed, widely circulated, and highly prestigious in the imperial centres where Judean exiles found themselves. We cannot, with the same confidence, point to a single tablet and say, this one is the blueprint for Noah. For some scholars, the overlaps in wording and sequence are enough to argue for direct influence, at least at the level of broad narrative pattern. For others, the differences in theology, moral framing, and post-flood logic are strong evidence that Genesis is not merely copying, but actively countering the Mesopotamian vision. In the end, the stories sit side by side like two languages describing the same storm. One speaks of noisy humans, overworked gods, and population control. The other speaks of human violence, divine sorrow, and a covenant that binds heaven and earth together after catastrophe. They share a skeleton of events, but the heart beating inside each one is tuned to a different set of fears and hopes. And that perhaps is the most revealing thing about the comparison. It shows us not just that cultures remember floods, but how they choose to remember them, what they decide needs explaining, justifying, redeeming when the waters finally go down. So where does all of this leave us as we lie here in the dark with Atrahasis and Noah still drifting somewhere in the back of the mind? A few things are on pretty solid ground. We know that by the early 2nd millennium BCE, long before the Hebrew Bible in its final form, Mesopotamian scribes were already writing down a sophisticated flood story with a chosen survivor, a boat, animals, a world-ending storm, and a post-flood sacrifice. We know that this story, or pieces of it, were influential enough to be reworked into the Epic of Gilgamesh and copied and recopied for centuries. We also know that by the time Genesis took shape, those Mesopotamian traditions were part of the cultural weather of the ancient Near East. They were there in the libraries, in the schools, in the stories of empire that smaller peoples like Israel had to live inside and argue with. What we don't know, and probably never will know, is the exact path from one text to another. We can't sit in the scriptorium and watch a Judean scribe lay a clay tablet of Atrahasis next to his own scroll and start adapting. The line from "here is a Mesopotamian flood myth" to "here is the story of Noah" is broken by time, lost copies, and centuries of oral retelling. So when we go back to that question, before Noah, the answer is both yes and careful. Yes, in the sense that the Atrahasis tablets we have are older than the biblical flood narrative in the form we know it, and they already carry a fully formed version of the flood pattern. Yes, in the sense that Mesopotamian flood lore is clearly earlier in the written record, and almost certainly part of the background that later writers, including Israelite ones, were breathing. But careful, because before is not the same as blueprint. Atrahasis is not a rough draft of Genesis that someone simply edited into monotheism. It is its own world with its own questions. How do gods manage labour? How do they handle regret? How do they keep humans from becoming too much? Genesis is another world asking, what does divine justice look like? What is wrong with human hearts? Is there a promise that can hold after everything has been washed away? Behind both, and behind the dozens of other flood tales scattered across cultures, there is something more basic, the way water terrifies and fascinates us. The way people living near great rivers or fragile coasts learn that everything can be fine one year and gone the next. The way survivors sit together afterward and tell stories that try to turn chaos into meaning. Sometimes those stories sound like memory, faint echoes of real disasters. Sometimes they sound like fear, exaggerated into myth. Sometimes they sound like community therapy. We made it through. Here's why. Here's what it means. Here's how to live now. Maybe that's part of why these old clay tablets still speak to us. Beneath the strange names and divine politics, you can hear very human voices trying to do exactly what we do after our own floods and fires and pandemics. Make sense, make patterns, make promises. If you imagine those tablets resting in the cool darkness of an ancient archive, it's almost like they're little boats themselves. Narrow rectangles of clay, pushed into wet shape by human hands, loaded up with lines of wedges that carry fear and hope and argument. Then they're dried, buried, broken, scattered, and centuries later dug up and read again. Each time someone sounds them out, an Assyrian student, a Victorian scholar, you listening right now in a different language and a different world, the voices launch again, crossing millennia the way a river crosses a plain. So as you drift off, you might picture that, shelves of clay, layer upon layer, Atrahasis beside Gilgamesh, beside other lost stories, all of them quietly insisting that even when the waters rise, even when cities vanish, something of us can endure. A story, a question, a warning, a prayer. If this slow journey through ancient floods has kept you company tonight, you can gently tap like, so more wandering insomniacs and curious minds can find it. If you want to hear more history told this way, in the long, quiet arc between archaeology and myth, you can subscribe and settle in for future nights. And if you're still awake enough to type, I'd love to know where you're listening from. What river, what coast, what city or countryside. Drop it in the comments. And for a moment, across all these time zones, we'll be part of the same little boat, floating together on a very old, very human story.